Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had with Alan Dove. During winter break, Dick and I had the opportunity to speak with Alan Dove, a motorsport enthusiast and professional with a focus on storytelling, performance analysis, and event management. Alan is the author of Motorsport Sagas, Unlocking the Power of Storytelling in Racing, where he dives into how storytelling amplifies the excitement of racing and helps drivers connect with fans. I became aware of him through his other book, The Science of the Racer's Brain, which explores the neuroscience behind elite racing drivers and their cognitive skills. As you'll hear, he is passionate about bringing the world of motorsport to a wider audience through content, coaching, and events. But before we get to our conversation, I need to ask, can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. Hope you enjoy our conversation. All right, Dick, we've got another interview.
I'm looking forward to it. This is going to be a great one.
I think so too. And largely because, as you know, I kind of geek out. And when I read a really good book or I read really good articles on Substack, I want to then find out who that person is, their story, and take this knowledge that I've learned to a whole nother level. So I'm really excited to introduce to our audience, Alan Dove. And Alan, do you want to say hello?
Hello, everybody.
And Dick, I wanted to see if you wanted to go first in starting the conversation, or you would like me to.
Well, given that Alan and I are both karters and have a real passion for the sport, I would love to, but I think that in the interest of time, it's probably better if the adult in the room were to step in and lead this conversation, because I'm pretty certain that Alan and I could go way down a rabbit hole and have a wonderful time and be completely off script in no time. That's my guess.
Okay, well then I will take the lead on just doing a little bit of our foundation so our audience will understand why both of us are very excited to have Alan here. Because Alan, would you just tell us a little bit about your background? I know I could say your bio, but I love for people to be able to share about themselves.
Okay, so I was my brother started karting a year after I was born, so I've always been involved in kart racing in one form or another. I started racing in 1995 at club level, where I had the fortunate experience of having to have to be racing someone like Lewis Hamilton. Sort of all the sort of drivers you have to come up against. This was like at club level. It's like, okay, the statistical greatest driver of all time, and that's all I had to deal with. So I was like, oh, this is great. And back then, you kind of knew that he was on the pathway to great things. I think nowadays they call it aura. And even at that age, he had it. And then I sort of took a break from karting once I was a teenager. And then I got back into it in when I was about 16, 17 from a media perspective. And so with my brother, I started karting one. He also started a kart coaching business. And from that, a lot of things intersected. I ended up working as a driver coach at GTSRS in London. And the way that I work is I'm like a perennial contrarian to a certain extent. So every time I see something being written about or spoken about, my instinct is like, that feels wrong. You know, it's like an instinctive reaction, even when it's not. And something that sort of dawned on me over time as I was reading a lot and hearing a lot about driver coaching and stuff like that, even from like people that have worked in F1, and I could never really get a handle on where all this was coming from, and it just felt a bit anecdotal. So part of me was like, I wanted to get into the science of it a bit more. So, you know, you do the usual thing, you start getting into the science of it, reading studies after studies. And one name popped up, Otto Lappi, who is a cognitive scientist at Helsinki University, and he was writing some good stuff about eye strategies and stuff like that. And I'd worked a little bit on eye strategies in driving myself, but a lot of it just felt a little bit like I'm just saying stuff, backward engineering stuff, you know, good drivers do this, and I couldn't really explain why. So I reached out to him because he was doing some really good stuff, and we obviously conversed quite a lot. He's a big motorsport first person, and over time we just sort of agreed that maybe it's time to write a book about this. And obviously I've got experience in motorsport, he's got way more experience in the science side of stuff. But we come together, we decided to write a book, and then The Science of the Racer's Brain came from that. And part of the reason we wanted to write a book was not so much to explain things and say, it's not, this is how to go fast. It's not that book. This is the skill of driving. We try to explain why it's quite remarkable how the top drivers do what they do, and also to inspire other scientists around the world to look into it and to discover how interesting it is, because it is interesting and it's something that you can study quite well from a neuroscientific perspective, especially now we have sims and stuff like that. And I look at it very similar to the way sort of musicology and neuroscience has come together in the last decade or so. I don't know if you've ever read Oliver Sacks, but he has a really, really good book on it, and the sort of the way that music and the brain is the way that it works is quite an amazing thing. So I was partly inspired by that as well. So yeah, and obviously it's I can meander for hours about the stuff that I've done, but I've got a lot of different interests, and so I guess the book and my career sort of, I'm always trying to coalesce my various interests. And recently I did another book called Motorsport Sagas, Unlock the Power of Storytelling in Racing, which was talking about how storytelling works in a motorsport context and how it explains value and why some series feel more valuable than others, and stuff like that. So yeah, that's how I interact with motorsport. It's very varied.
Well, for me, I think this only makes me respect your work more because I've actually talked to a number of friends. We've discussed that I'm a person who has varied interests, and many people, they go, I can't believe you're a motorsport enthusiast and specifically Formula One. And I said, but if you start to walk into this world, you realize so many people come from so many different backgrounds, so many different interests and skill sets. And then the commonality is that you love the racing aspect of this. And so I find with the synergy that you tried to create of looking at it from a different dimension of not just simply technique, but the actual intellectual component of this and the cognitive, I guess, is really fascinating to me, which is why I really enjoyed the book. The book really impacted me as a non-racer because I think the way that you approached it helped to make it easier for a non-racer to understand, as you said, just the skill and the brain as it's working with these racers. So I had a deeper appreciation. Of course, you were putting it into the karting context, but as I was looking at it in the Formula One, I realized that's all skills that they had to have learned early on in their career. And we're just seeing this exemplified on the grid at a very high level, which I think probably our audience would say that's why I have such a high respect for the racers that are there, because I know that they have honed these skills. And so your book was really instrumental in me seeing that component. I wanted to actually highlight, there was a table that you had on there. And I think, Dick, I brought it up when we were talking to a young American racer, Ashlyn Speed, because I wanted to see like more in the practical sense, this distinction that I think you drew, which is everyday driving versus expert driving. I thought that was super helpful because, when you're viewing on a screen, at least in my experience, when you're viewing on a screen, the driver, you don't really fully grasp all the expertise that is coming in and the difference of their experience. So why do you think it was so vital at the beginning of your book to set that distinction?
It was interesting because I get memories that pop in my head, and I've got a faint recollection of a study that studied people watching onboard cameras, and the sort of expert drivers, their brains were lighting up in different sectors as the non-expert drivers, and it was specifically the retrosplenial cortex. And it was quite funny because that was one of the early things that I was reading about quite a lot that sort of inspired the book. And I have to say at this point that Otto Lappi is the cognitive scientist here, so a lot of the weight and the sort of flesh of the book comes from Otto, so he has to be given all the credit there. The issue with race driving is people watch it and they don't think it doesn't look that hard, and their point of reference is driving a car, and it's like visually someone driving about in a car isn't a million miles away from just watching someone drive an F1 car. So it's important that we made an effort to try and make people understand that it is very different. I can't explain it like, the difference is like holding a broom up, and you can hold it and balance it, and then he says, right, you got to balance the broom on the palm of your hand. Both essentially kind of the same thing, but instinctively how different they are. Because obviously you hold a broom up with your fist and you're gripping it, it doesn't feel like you're having to balance anything. And then as soon as you're trying to balance it with the palm of your hand, even though it's the same outcome, which is you're trying to keep the thing upright, one is measurably almost a completely different dimension of task. So it's important just to people it's important to try and explain to people how different it really is. So that was that sort of part of the book. I mean, we invested, I think I recall correctly, we invested quite a lot of time in just trying to emphasize how different it is, really.
I would highly recommend the book to any of our listeners because I think the way that you approached it really does help us to have such a deeper understanding of the expertise in there. And so actually on page 59, this is how much of a geek I am. I wrote down the quote. You wrote, of the many challenges a racer's brain has to tackle, perhaps most widely underappreciated is knowing the geometrical layout of a race circuit. It seems so simple at face value. You go there and you have a look. You can see where the track goes, can't you? But when you delve into it, you can find it is not simple at all. It's actually one of the most remarkable feats of long-term memory performance in sports. It's really that detailed memory of the circuit layout that affords a racing driver the foresight and anticipation they need. This is what gives the driver the confidence to push a car towards its limits. So I'd like to actually unpack that a bit because especially now when in the Formula One world, there's 24 races, we have so much technology, there's all these different things that are happening. I wanted to hear your thoughts on how this applies to both maybe the current grid, notable racers of the past. Who comes to your mind that really exemplifies this principle? And even do you see this sheer pace, the sheer volume of races impacting the ability of the current grid to even continue to execute at the level that we would expect them to because of this underappreciated value of memorization of the track?
It's an interesting one. I think part of we have as a cultures in as humans is sometimes we underappreciate just how remarkable we are, what we are able to achieve. And it's always, people take something like language for granted, and you just think, a child comes into the world with we can delve into the detail of whatever, but it's always a remarkable feat that we can learn whole languages from nothing. And I think with race driving, you can go back to the 60s, the Mille Miglia. I mean, it depends how much you remember. I'm very interested in the TT, I guess, in terms of an astounding achievement of what a human is truly capable of. So that's something I think instinctively people look at the TT and you immediately know, okay, I get why this is incredible. It's 20 minutes. They're doing these lap of the island in and averaging 135 miles per hour now, the actual lap record pace.
You're to the Isle of Man, Alan?
I have not been to the Isle of Man. I've always planned to do so. I'm trying to get carts back on the Isle of Man, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But yeah, it's just trying to. I think it's that what appears unremarkable is remarkable in the sense that, how do I put this? It's something that only really becomes remarkable when you try and replicate it in artificial terms and AI and stuff like that. It's not a question I really can expand upon so much, if that makes sense.
It's either you do or you don't. It's a little bit like a driver being able to adapt to a car that really isn't his driving style. That's an area where, as a driver myself, I find it remarkable how the top guys, they come up to the grid, they know the cart or the car is not necessarily to their liking, but they know how to drive around the problem at the end of the day, and they can adapt their style and be quick. It's the same deal like you're talking about. It's
the same. It's that's an interesting one because you're trying to understand what the model of driving that someone has, how that model's constructed from a sort of cognitive perspective. What is their model of driving in their brain, and how does it compare from driver A to driver B? What expectations does driver A have? What expectations does driver B have? And how do they manifest themselves in the actions that they take on a circuit? A lot of driving is anticipatory kind of mechanisms. I think a lot of capital's put into reaction times. And I always like to say you're not really reacting. If you're reacting to something, it's already gone wrong. It's more about how a driver anticipates what a car is going to do and how detailed is their model of driving. It's a difficult one to explore to a certain extent because it's like, I think I used to be big into chess, and I guess if you look at someone like Magnussen or Kasparov, it's like what makes chess player A better than chess player B when they're at that higher level. Really, the book is trying to delve into that and encourage others to look into it as well. A lot of capital, like I said, to put into reaction times, easy things to digest for people. They might say with eye strategy as well is an interesting one. So eye strategies generally boil down to a top level driver looks further ahead than other drivers. And
Right.
I always was slightly skeptical by that because it just felt a bit like backward engineering. It's like the top driver does this because we've observed it, thus copy it. And I've always thought, yeah, but how do they assess what is their eye strategy on the first lap of the weekend, their second lap of the weekend, the third lap of the weekend? It's like we have these big gaps in knowledge where you might get the end result that a top driver does something or performs something, but how did they get to that point? How did they reach those conclusions? And how did that intersect with the model of expectations they have from a car in the first place? So yes, it's like when we talk about, the how does a driver learn a racetrack? And obviously this was spoken about just a minute ago. The interesting thing I'd love to find out a bit more about is what is their learning process? How do they approach a new circuit? Because we're not really privy to this information because, like I said, eye trackers are only often used as kind of, they'll put them on the top driver and then they backward engineer from that. And I'm like, yeah, okay, how did they get to that point? What were they doing? And I coined a term, returnative tangent point fixation strategy. And that was the kind of thing where drivers might be going through a long curve and their eye might be a bit further ahead than what you'd expect, but then they would have a saccade to the sort of the apex or the sort of where the sort of direction it intersects with the apex, and their eyes will be fluttering back and forth. Yeah, and I'd love to see more research done into that. But yeah, that's kind of what I find interesting.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's absolutely fascinating. The level of computing power that's going on between the ears and the milliseconds, taking in all this information, making decisions, all of that. And it's constant for 2 hours or whatever the race distance may be, it's absolutely remarkable. And I think that speaking as a driver myself, is when you do it well, it is incredibly satisfying to get it that way, and get it right because you've made the right decisions through the weekend or through the race or whatever the case may be.
What I find interesting is how, again, like we put a lot of capital in things like reaction times or bravery and stuff like that. And I've always felt like bravery can only get you so far, and it starts to delve into more intelligence based conversations. And I always use, I think we talk about chess in the book and stuff, and it becomes more like, if you're a top chess player, you're doing everything right, but Magnussen, for example, and you'd have to face that and go, he's just a little bit better than me, and you can't really understand why. And it's like with driving, like the difference between, say, Max Verstappen and maybe not a great example, but another driver. It will literally be a kilometer here, a kilometer there, a little bit different approach to releasing the brake. These are tiny differences that are really, really difficult to manifest in your own brain, to imagine what another driver's doing. It is, I've been involved in high level motorsport, and I can't tell you how draining it is just alone trying to comprehend why you're losing half a tenth a corner. And then that's why you go into, it's not a bravery thing, because you can go into a corner flat out. I used to test with a friend of mine, and we'd have a corner that was like a flat out corner, and he would do it. I'd go flat out through it, and he would lift off literally a couple of mil on the throttle, and he would be quicker than I. And it was like learning those sort of weird little things that you have to kind of imagine and then put into actual practice. It delves more into the realm of sort of intelligence, and obviously, people, how you measure intelligence and varies and that kind of thing. But it really is that kind of area when we're talking about differences between driver A and driver B. It comes down to some kind of very difficult to understand things, and because we're humans, we like to make it very simple, but it is so difficult to understand when you see two drivers and the onboards look very similar, and driver A is doing the apex a little bit quicker, and then you go, right, just do it. It's like, it's not that easy.
No, it's not at all. I love I don't know if you're familiar with the name Carroll Smith, but he was involved with Carroll Shelby back when they were doing, the Ford GT40 program and at Le Mans and all that. And he wrote a number of books on the sport, whether it was how to prepare a car or whatever. And one of the things he said he said, the thing you have to remember about auto racing is it's supposed to be difficult.
And
And
the thing, like, back then, I guess the nature of the cars made it a little bit easier to spot expertise.
Yeah.
Differences. Just, it's not that modern racing is easier. It isn't. It's hard. It's harder in a sense because it's harder to see the differences.
yeah,
Whereas, you look at classic racing and you can literally you can spot who's good a lot quicker.
Yep.
Just because they've got a lot more to do and they're taking care of the car, and so it's in a sense it's no less difficult now to try and be quick. It's just harder to analyze, like and like everything homogenizes, but yeah, it's very much more difficult now to spot the differences, which makes it almost more interesting, and you can start to go really into the detail of the mechanisms of the brain, because it is the differences are so small. That's where you end up going down the rabbit hole. Whereas maybe 60 years ago, if a driver goes through a corner flat out and there's a concrete wall on the exit and driver B isn't, you go, well, we can see it may be more of a bravery thing, but no, it's not so much that.
or a distinct lack of imagination. It's one or the other.
Yeah, exactly.
When I listen to you, Alan, I'm thinking Kino's palette, where you go, there's an instructor at the front of the room with a clean canvas, and then there's tables of people that have their own canvas, and they've also been preset with their paint. And then the idea is you bring your glass of wine and you get to have this group activity. And they've shown you the picture at the end of the session that you should end up with. And when I'm listening to you, Alan, it just made me think of like, racecraft is very much artistry, just in a different realm. And because you have the instructor at the front saying, okay, now go do a vertical line here, do a horizontal here, use this specific color that they've already put on your palette for you. But then at the end of the session, you have people like me who it looks okay, great. You've got some people that maybe are artists by background, and then there's just other people who've never picked up a brush and their thing looks even better than what the instructor said. Like they maybe did some tweaks, they mixed some colors, and you sit there and you kind of go, how in the world did you see that? Like, how did you realize that would be a wise decision to do? And sometimes those people are like, oh, I don't know, I just kind of did it, And as I listen to you, I feel like that's what you're talking about, but in the motorsport context.
It's very the creative sector. You find that not so much in the driving side of things, but I'll return to that. I'll give you a very sort of correlative example of what you just said. But there's a lot of creativity in motorsport. A lot of it's hidden. I'm lucky to obviously know a few people, but there's a lot of creativity. It just isn't in the modern motorsport context. It's often not quite as celebrated so much because of the way that the social media works. But there's a lot of creative people. The thing that you spoke about there, you could sort of talk about Senna's throttle technique. I used to study this a long time ago, and I went down another rabbit hole with that because I was unsatisfied with the explanation people were given, which is, the guys, because it was spooling the boost in Turbo F1, and I was sitting there going, that doesn't sound right to me, because he did it in cars afterwards with naturally aspirated engines, and and knowing his karting stuff, and he did it in karts as well. So I did a whole video on it. If you look Senna throttle on the GTSR RS channel, I sort of did a big feature on this. Was like years ago.
Do this. Center throttle, huh? I got to
yeah.
At that.
And so he stabs the throttle, and it's totally unlike everything else. And obviously, like if Jackie Stewart always used to say, don't put the throttle on and then take it off. It's like it's got to be, you put it on and you're not going to take it off again. I only put the throttle on when you're not going to come off the throttle again. It's like, and I was sitting there going, yeah, but Senna was like, had this mad frequency when he was stabbing the throttle like a lunatic, right? And it was so fast that you could go, this is an instinctive thing, So I went down and down that rabbit hole. And so I did a big thing. I said, it's nothing to do with turbos. He did it before F1 and he did it in karts. And the slow-mos, you can sort of see him doing it. And a friend of mine, Oliver Scullion, who I organise kart race meetings with, he actually sent me a link to a Japanese interview that he did for Japanese TV, and it's actually gone from YouTube. But I did a follow up video, and you can see him talking about his throttle technique. And he said, "I don't know why I do it. I just do it, and I've done it for a long time, and that's it." And it's that kind of thing, right? Like what you were saying with the paint, he's not going to. He can sit there and go, "I do it because of this, this, and this." I hypothesized. I come up with ideas because it's not a. It's a throttle technique you use in sim racing. If you don't have pedals and you've only got buttons, you'll stab the button to give you some kind of modulation. But I thought maybe his first car had a very on-off throttle. Maybe when he was 4 years old and it come from that. That was just me hypothesizing. But he said himself, I don't really understand it. All I know that it takes a lot of mental power to do. If you've ever tried it, like Senna, it's incredibly difficult to master because you can sort of emulate it. But to do it instinctively is a whole different thing. I do it myself when I'm in extreme moments where I've lost control of the car. I'll stab the throttle and I don't really know why. But it comes back to that creativity thing. A lot of these things kind of come from weird places. It's very difficult. We actually mentioned in the book how communication to drivers to engineers, especially in bikes, can be done with hand movements. So you're not even linguistically trying to explain things. There's these layers of communication in motorsport that are interesting in their own right. You can't just say, Senna couldn't say why he did it. It was just something he felt. So there you get that kind of artistic kind of molding with artistry and creativity in motorsport. It's a lot closer than people really appreciate sometimes. But it is there.
Okay, well then that actually leads me to the question of, because you brought up Senna karting at 4, help our listeners understand why karting is important to developing that racecraft. I think that you pointed one element that some of it is even just that initial entry into the sport pulls out those innate things, I would imagine. But what else comes out in the world of karting and developing racecraft?
So when I talk about karting, I do have a bit of a disclaimer in that I know there's a bit of study fatigue out there, but I think there's a bit of a merit to this, that in sports science, they're very much going down the road of high level expertise in youth sport doesn't necessarily mean high expertise as a senior. So we always have to be a little bit careful about talking about motorsport and young drivers, because I feel like to a certain extent that the sport's a bit distorted at the moment. So I don't place too much importance on drivers when they're that young. And this is purely because I have experience with what's happening in kart racing. And I've always felt we have to be a little bit careful how we talk about it. But, so you can start karting at 12, 13 and 14 and not feel, because I'm involved in karting a lot. So I see a lot of young kids who write on forums like, I'm 14, 15. Is it too late to start motorsport and do karting? And I'm like, no, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. So what, if you're talking about what you get, I think it's not that karting is important. Karting just happens to be the thing that you can do, so to speak. So it like I'm a big karting person and it's like I'm doing an anti-sales thing for karting, but it's more a case of, because you can get it from sim racing as well now. You can get the whole learning the basics as well from that. The karting is just accessible, and it gives you that experience of consequence. But yeah, I mean, I actually think sim racing can give you the 99% of the same learning potential as kart racing. Now there are secondary factors that we might not understand from a motion through space and how the brain interacts and how that develops into as you get older. So there is sort of, we can say, okay, maybe doing real stuff. But karting's main advantage is that you can do it relatively cheaply and gain experience relatively cheaply. There's nothing intrinsic in a kart, I don't think, that would be beneficial over something else. It's just something that you that happen to do. So it's just, I think karting is the most accessible form of motorsport. So it's just the cheapest way to get experience. If you look at the schedule of an F4 driver and F3 driver, they don't really get that much time to practice, and it's very expensive. So yeah, it's not that karting is important for developing racecraft. It just happens to be the most accessible.
So what I'm hearing you say is that if karting wasn't available, sim racing now would be the entry into the sport.
I think sim racing already is. This is where I'll get on my soapbox. I'm not a big fan of entry into the sport language or grassroots, because when we say grassroots motorsport, I always say, yeah, but what happens to grass? It gets walked over. When I talk about karting and stuff, because karting is its own sport, really. And especially in its original formation, it was a bit more of a chest-out kind of sport, owned itself a bit more. And over time, it's sort of become a bit reclusive in terms of what it means to be a kart driver. Because as karting became accessible to juniors and cadets, naturally it becomes, you can get into motorsport this young. And then once that happens, people start thinking about careers and F1. So the culture of karting goes from being a sport that was largely adult oriented, which was not in the 60s, it was 95% adult oriented, to now being like 30% adult oriented, and it's more of a junior thing now. So it's just that like with anything, it's what is there, and that's what people do because it's there. You know, if something else had come along and replaced karts as the inverted commas grassroots of motorsport and where you start racing if you want to be in F1, if something else could come and replace it, I think a large part of the market would go and do that instead. Sim racing now is fantastic. I've always been an advocate of sim racing. You know, I was racing Live for Speed and R Factor in like 2005, 2006. Friend of mine, Will Dendy, he introduced me to it. And obviously we all remember Gran Turismo and that kind of stuff. So I think sim racing is fantastic. You know, of course, how much do you learn in terms of the real life skills? You know, most of it you can learn in sims. I'm pretty confident in that. So I'm a big karting advocate, but I'm by no means, if you've got a goal in racing cars or whatever, sim racing is fantastic.
I wanted to ask a follow-up question. When you said that karting had historically been more adult and now it's gone down to like probably 30%, when did you say that shift occurred?
It's basically, so in 1968, it was a book by Alan Burgess called Going Karting, and he made a little thing, a chapter called Junior Karting, and he opened it and said 95% of karters are adults, but some kids can try it. So when it began, you got to remember, it began in the car parks of California, Art Ingalls and Livingston, and it's like it was just fellas who wanted to race, and they sort of come up with this idea of racing cars. So, you know, and if you look at the 60s, you had some like unbelievable events like Vevey, which is on Lake Geneva. They were racing at Monaco, and you can watch the old footage, and it's just like unbelievable. And they're adults racing. That's what the sport was. And naturally, like any business, you see a gap in the market, and karts are naturally smaller than a car. You can put a kid in it, and as soon as children entered the sport and it progressed over time, slowly but surely, naturally you start going, right. But it didn't begin with Senna, but as soon as Senna got to F1 and started talking about karting, people started to see the link a lot closer, and that's set in stone. A move towards younger and younger people. And also, we can talk about the business aspect to it. It's, you know, parents with children are more likely to spend a lot of money. As soon as F1 enters the equation, a lot of costs go up, and there's a lot of negative aspects to it. It's a difficult one, I know, for your listeners, because obviously this is an F1 podcast, but there are consequences to these kind of things. So it's something that happened over time, and I guess it's something that naturally would have occurred. It's something you can't legislate against it, so to speak. But, you know, like in England, we introduced cadets in 1988. So that was the 8 to 12 group. So cadet karting started in this country in 1988, and before that we didn't really have children that young racing. So you got to think, like, when you see all those videos of Hamilton as a kid racing Champions of the Future, the cadet class had only been around for 8 years at that point, and prior to that you started karting at about 12. But years and years it was 14. So that's just how things go.
I find that so fascinating, especially because I just completed the Netflix series on Senna. Have you seen that yet, or are you aware of it?
I am polluted with knowledge about the 1979 Estoril World Karting Championship. So much so that after I watched the depiction of that, I was like, I can't continue.
Okay. Oh, well, okay, that's definitely a tangent. We'll have to have you on for a different conversation. As, again, the non-racer, not having the depth of the history in the sport that you have, I found it interesting how they did show his karting in different elements over the course of the episode. And I kept thinking, I wonder what this was like. Because I find it interesting when you say that it was more adult in the world of karting than what we see now. Because I've instinctually wondered, when did we allow that? So this kind of history that you're providing helps in my brain. I'm still processing everything you just said. Because I do think that, as you noted, and you can definitely go into this, about the business aspect of Formula One. And you can't put a kid 8 or 10 or 12 into a Formula One car. And this idea of the long-term investment in developing their craft, I can see where, as you kind of are not a proponent of the term entry, the world of karting being relegated into this kind of second status. But if that had not historically been what it was, and as you noted, adults wanting to just do this, and the history of this sport of karting as a sport, how that would be frustrating. Its own right has its value and brings a whole different dimension to the full scale of motorsport in general.
Yeah, motorsport is a very complex beast, you know, and it's got a lot of branches and loops and stuff like that. And the main reason I have a problem with the way that karting is now portrayed is someone like yourself who says you're a non-racer. And to me, it's like, yeah, but I'd rather turn you into a racer, and you can go and get a kart and you can go race it. That's perfectly normal. And that's happened since the 60s. Do you know what I mean? So for me, I just think when I listen to you and you say I'm a non-racer, I'm sitting there going, you can be a racer if you want next week. You can go get yourself a secondhand car. You can go and get involved and start feeling that emotion yourself. Because I'm very much into the getting people to drive. And karting is like the best for that in terms of real racing. It's beyond it. Nothing comes close. You know, Dick will tell you, nothing comes close to it. So, but when karting is portrayed as the kids' sport, that thing doesn't enter your ideas. You go like someone like yourself, I'm a non-racer, and you just see F1, and I'm like, yeah, but you can just go and race if you want. And I want to put that idea in your head. And the problem that we have at the moment with motorsport is that people go, oh, you know, F1 is what motorsport is. And then I've got to start you would not believe how many times I've seen people post, am I too old for karts? 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 And I'm like, no. You know, the first world champion was a guy called Guido Sala, and he was like 36, 37 when he was winning his world championships. And, you know, it's kind of like, and actually, if you look at the KZ World Championship at the moment, which is the gearbox stuff, their average age is about the same as F1, you know, so it's the same age people racing. So it's just one of those things that I just feel like your listeners and yourself, you know, the way that the trajectory of modern motorsport's going is I just want to, when I talk about karting in terms of F1, I'm just like, you know, you can go and do karting if you want.
Yeah.
And you can start to expand your, and it was certainly, this is the great thing about it is, I mean, rental karting, which you'll be experienced, and everyone's tried to be a rental karting, but it's not the same really, because you don't get that feeling of like, oh, this is a bit much, you know? That feeling of like, this is a bit much is something that as someone that watches motors, if someone who wants to watch motorsport and get a deeper feeling for it, having that feeling of like, whoa, this is a bit much. It changes the way that you interact with Formula 1. So it's like, well, I do, you know, if anyone knows me, I'm very critical of F1 at times. But you can increase your appreciation of F1 by just going to try karting or something similar.
Yeah.
You know, it's just kind of happens to be the most accessible thing.
You know, Alan, just as a side note, at the Supernats this past month, in the KZ Masters class, there were 51 entries. And the oldest driver was 67 years old.
It's incredible. Like,
Awesome.
Yeah. And the guy who came second is Baz Lammers, who's registered deaf. Just for your listeners, he's deaf. Yep. And he's one of the best kart drivers I've ever seen in my life. Oh, yeah. This is one of these, he's got so many inspirational stories. It's just one of those things I love to talk about whenever I get the chance. And like I said, I spoke to you before, I watched Schumacher race karts at the SCUSA Supernats in 2009. You know, the top F1 drivers, I mean, not so much nowadays, because I think the relationship a lot of top F1 drivers have with karting is not quite as positive as it once was for various reasons. But, you know, guys like Schumacher loved it. Like, he was racing at Kirpen, doing like relatively low level club races, and he's not dominating people, you know. Yeah. You know, he's just out there being a kart just like everyone else, you know. So it's just one of these things that, yeah, it's just something that I like to remember I'm talking, because obviously with the book and Science of the Racer's Brain, and we're talking about F1 and stuff, but for me, there's a lot of broader thing you can really get involved with. And I love the idea of people actually getting involved themselves, feeling like they can get involved and get your hands dirty.
I love that. Love it.
Well, yeah, I think, Dick, especially with your channel and Begin Again, trying to encourage people to see karting and what you're doing and your return into the world of racing is right in line with what Alan's saying. And like, Alan, it's really inspiring to hear that someone like me could go out there and jump in a cart and start being a racer. Like, I've totally
there was something in the 60s, what was very common was to see sort of husband and wife going karting, and she races, then he races. It was really, really common. That kind of thing was just normal.
What?
That's
Are you
because that's
serious? It's amazing.
then was just stuff like that. There's like you look at the old brochures and stuff, and the thing is with F1 is it's not just F1, but the sort of F1 influence, because F1 influence pervades a lot of motorsport. It's quite an incredible thing, which is really getting into the nitty gritty of it. But karting was very open, and it still can be like that today. It's not. It's the thing is, it's because it's such a niche activity. But yeah, I used to have husband and wife. You'd share the car. Occasionally, I think sometimes there were ladies races and not men's races, but I think there was a lot more there was a lot more female participation back then than there is now. Kind of interestingly. So you'd get that sort of, there might be a ladies race, they'd call it ladies race, which is a bit of an archaic term, but it was just like that. Everybody was just going and doing it because they were just trying to figure out how to get people in cars. So that was a much more open time, weirdly enough. People get shocked by it, but that's how it was. Yeah.
In Texas, Alan, it's really interesting. If you were to go to a club race like, the track where I race, you'd be surprised at how many females are out there as drivers. And it's a wide age range. Now, it seems to taper off after they hit about early 20s, but teenage girls, there's a lot of them, which is good to see. But I would like to see, older women doing it too.
Well, I mean, it depends what sort of tangent you want to go on, because I can talk about this for a long time. But I say, if you want to talk about females in motorsport, which I know you wanted to talk about, I've got.
Yeah,
there is something
totally.
so I guess I'll get it out. So karting has had a female world champion, Susanna Raganelli, in 1966. Fantastic driver. I did a big write-up about her, and I've been talking about her for a long time, and I find it very, very unusual that she's not a well-known character. I find it very strange. In all of these Get Women into Motorsport programs, she's always absent in the literature. So I've always been very suspicious of females in motorsport programs because of it, because I'm like, why aren't we talking about the greatest female driver of all time? She's the only female with an FIA World Championship. And obviously, you've got Kathy Muller as well. She won the 1979 European Championship. Lorraine Pett she came second, I think it was in 74, was it 77? In the Junior World Championship. She was tragically killed as well, actually, which is not a good story. And so female success in karting is not unusual at all. We've had, obviously, Max's mum, Sophie Kumpfen. See, Charlotte Hellberg was a brilliant driver. We had a team in the 1960s, which Sheila Van Dam, she ran a club called the Windmill Club, which was like a burlesque theatre in London, and she had an all-girls racing team from that. They would drive around London in carts, literally drive around London in carts. And it was an all-female team that she had. She was a rally driver. So, sometimes you have these documentaries, and like, I think Sterling Moss' sister was a driver, and you'd see these things. But like karting as a sport, actually, historically, has had a lot of female drivers. Mary Hicks. I could list hundreds of them, right? It's not like, we're not like overwhelmed with female drivers, but it's historically kind of normal.
Oh, yeah.
Good female drivers, right?
Yeah, I raced against a lady who's based here in Dallas. She's, I think, a couple of years younger than me, Rhonda Mims, and 6 national championships.
This is the thing. We could talk about karting and be like, we could list off female, like, is it Barbara Hepburn? Was it Barbara Hepburn, the supercar driver in Australia? She won, I think, Adelaide, which was a supercar. The Adelaide Grand Prix in 1987 or 86. Supercars were on a support bill, and she won one of those years.
No,
and I think
so awesome. Wow.
Yeah. So you got this. So for me, like, when we talk about women in motorsport, I'm sitting there going, it's not unusual. We're kind of used to it to a certain extent. And obviously, we've had a world champion in Susanna Raganelli, fantastic driver. There's a great story of her racing in Vevey. I think it was the 65 or 66 European Championship. Would have been 65 or 66. This was when karting had spectators, and there was there's reports of the police having to hold back 1,000 Italian fans with batons in this sort of, because it was they had the race in the market square, because I think she won the race, and it was, yeah, this is these mad stories in history. So when we talk about females in motorsport, I look at it like it's kind of normal, really. It's just that now we have a lot of companies who are trying to position themselves to, I guess, own the journey a bit. They want to own the female success a bit more, rather than being like, oh, there actually has been a lot of female success. You just don't want to talk about it for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm always a bit skeptical. When you said you don't see a lot of females racing karts or whatever over the age of 20 or 16, this is a problem that I have in general, is that we've kind of, the F1 story's become so important to motorsport that it's almost like anybody over the age of 16 racing karts is de facto a failure. Because it's like, it's an embarrassment, you shouldn't be there. So what we've done is we've tried to say we want to get more girls into karting, whereas I'm more like we should have more women racing karts.
Yeah.
Why are we not selling motorsport to everybody, 20s, 30s, 40s? Because I noticed that you might have an increase in young girls karting, but you're just trying to get them on the conveyor belt to try and hopefully find one or two that you then send to F1 Academy. I'm more in the sort of thing of like, okay, that's fine, but we're not really talking about, actually, I want to see sold to everybody to do karting in their 20s and 30s and 40s like it was back in the day. You know, that's why I talked to you, Sabrina, saying I'd love to see you try karting. Why not? That's more exciting to me than trying to go down this F1 route. Because I think F1 is a bit of a churn that's designed to kind of, you're trying to find the one. When you're trying to find the one, it means you're discarding people left, right, and centre trying to find the one. And I'm like, no. Motorsport is much more broader and more interesting a subject than just trying to find a special driver. How about let's expand it to give people the chance to experience motorsport and to enjoy it and go from there. And you'll find that you'll have more, you know, it's something that in me, because I've written about Susanna Raganelli so much. Like, I'm tired of it. That it bemuses me that because she won a karting world championship when she was 20 or 21, no one cares. And I think it's this astounding achievement. And we should talk about it a lot more. But because everyone's so obsessed with F1, you don't really hear these stories. Sorry about me going on a tangent there, but it's
Not at all.
Because I see someone like Raganelli or even Kathy Muller and all these top drivers over the years, even like Charlotte Helberg, man, it's like unbelievable. She won like a European Championship race in '96 at Lonato, and you see her after the race. She's been interviewed, and she says she's asked, who do you want to thank? She thanks her mum, and she gets quite emotional. And it's kind of this quite nice little moment where she'd reached sort of pinnacle of the sport, and it doesn't really get recognised how good she really was because we're so F1 focused. I know this is an F1 podcast, don't get me wrong, I'd love to talk about F1, Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton and all that, but I'm always just, we just have this broad range of motorsport that you can sort of enjoy, and get involved with.
I agree. I think you agree as well, Dick. I think that what I love is the enthusiasm of elevating karting and making it approachable, accessible to everybody, then transcends the appreciation for motorsport disciplines across the spectrum. Because if once you're in the racing in a kart, then you start to see the very application of the things that I think you wrote in your book, because you start to see it for yourself. You're experiencing it. So then you are able to respect that if you see it in a rally racer, in a Le Mans racer, an endurance racing. And so by having karting as that opportunity because of the accessibility, as you pointed out earlier in the conversation, and saying that this can be for the full range of ages, it really just will be fertilizer for motorsport in general across the globe. And also, I would even say here in the United States.
Actually, America's very exciting at the moment. I think you've got a lot of good events. You've got a lot of sort of variability there. And you've got some fantastic drivers. AJ Myers, Danny Formal, who he sort of does Lamborghinis now, but he does karting when he can.
Yep.
Ryan Norberg. Obviously you want to talk about trying to get F1 drivers. Say, why don't you get more F1 drivers from America? And it's not that you don't have the talent there in karting, because you've got some of the best drivers in the world. It's just a geographical thing, really, and some amazing events. The move from the Rio to Las Vegas Speedway for the Supernats hasn't been a positive one in my view, but it's still one of the best motorsport events in the world.
Yeah, I mean, Alan, it's funny that you should mention that because, two of the drivers that we follow in this documentary that I was telling you about, Jordan Musser and Martin Stone, right? And Musser's won the Pro Tour like 5 times, I think, something like that. I mean, he's unbelievable KZ driver. And then Martin Stone, he was Lando Norris's tuner when Norris won the world championship. This guy has cleaned up in Vegas. I think he's got like 4 or 5 wins in Vegas now, something like that. I mean, Martin is incredible.
But this is the thing, like, I don't want to plug my other book. But I talk about why Motorsport Sagas, I sort of talk about the storytelling nature of motorsport and why we engage with F1 or Valentino Rossi in MotoGP. I sort of frame it around the hero's journey that often is used to write movies, and anyone who does storytelling, it's a bit of a cliche, but I thought I had to hang it on something. But when you look at various other motorsports, you can start to appreciate just the level that some of these drivers reach. I really like some of the American drivers, what they're doing at the highest levels, and guys like AJ Myers, Danny Formal, Norberg, these are the ones that just spring to mind. They're unbelievable talents. And these drivers, these are the sort of drivers that when F1 drivers do hop back in a car for the Supernats, this is why they don't win. They don't go out and win. I mean, I think the last year Will Power he did X30, but he did it in X30 Masters.
Right.
Do X30 normal. And I was like, yeah, why? Because it's so competitive.
Oh, yeah.
I've got a lot of time for Will Power, actually. I think the fact he still races, I think he does a lot of KZ stuff now. I think he sort of credited a lot of his return to form doing a lot of KZ stuff.
Yep.
For you listeners, KZ is the shifter kart, by the way.
Right.
So it's a gearbox kart with, for anyone that doesn't know what we're talking about. But
yeah.
I talk about Motorsport Sagas and storytelling in motorsport because you start to learn why F1 dominates the headlines so much. There's so much value on it. Like I find it incredible. Like even, whether there's a yellow flag for a bit of debris on the circuit at the weekend becomes the headline story. It's kind of funny,
right?
And it's like it's just how humans value things and where we place value and why it explains to a large extent why F1 dominates so much the landscape.
Is the book already out?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I know it's a bit of a plug, but
it's totally fine.
Totally
Please be to plug stuff.
I wanted to explain to people why there's a lot of things where people go, "Oh, F1 isn't the best." Well, they often says it isn't the best racing. F1 isn't the best racing, and I always like to tell people, I says, understand what supply and demand means. Good racing is not in short supply in motorsport. High stakes racing is, and F1 is the most high stakes racing. So a lot of people they get off track a little bit trying to promote IndyCar or whatever else, and I'm like, you got to bear in mind that people don't listen to what people say, actually observe what people do. People say they prefer good close racing, but what they actually prefer quite a lot of the time is less good racing with more high stakes, because high stakes is really what makes something worthwhile. And actually people prefer to have a bit of dominance than just having 6 or 7 winners all the time, and it becomes a bit random. So this is why I always try to explain to people why F1 dominates so much, because a lot of people seem to not understand the mechanisms. The fact that all the teams build their own cars contributes to the high stakes feeling. It creates domination, but it's David and Goliath. We like the David and Goliath stories. We like domination, and then we like to see that end eventually. But this is how narrative arcs work in motorsport. It's something that I find quite intriguing. But luckily, because I'm interested in karting, I can invest emotion into it and value because I happen to be an expert in it. So I can those mechanisms that make it feel high stakes exist in me. I understand for other people, if I say, Lorenzo Travasanuto is one of the best drivers in the world, for most people that's meaningless. But to me, it does mean something.
And so where can they get the book? Any of us?
That's on Amazon. That one's
okay.
On Amazon.
And it's called Motorsport Saga.
Yeah, Motorsport Sagas unlock the power of storytelling in racing.
Okay, yeah. Fantastic. We'll definitely get that link both to that book and to your other book, the one that got me on this path of wanting to learn from you. Let's see. I think that actually we've done a great job of going through a lot of the questions I'd written down, and you've covered it so organically. You've been restrained, as you said, you could go off on tangents, but we have some time. Are there things that you feel like we haven't covered that would be helpful for our audience?
It's absolutely. I mean, which rabbit hole do you want to go down?
Well, how about this? You may have a ton, but let's choose one. And if you're good with it, we'd love to have you come back on and have further conversations with us, because I think what you've put out here is very enlightening. I know, at least for me, I hope it is for our audience, is to see the value of karting as its own discipline. And yes, it has its connection to what has brought many of us into the sport of motorsport as Formula One, but to have a greater respect for racers in a different discipline. I mean, you may not have listened to our other episodes, but we've also reached out to people inside the IndyCar world, because I think the three of us feel that motorsport in general has so much value. It gives us so many principles on the individual discipline, the team discipline, the business, the politics, the technology. And then if you have a greater appreciation for the context of what you're approaching anything, it gives you greater appreciation to be able to see where it is today and where it has the possibility to go. And so I think you've just added a whole nother layer of conversation and opportunity to educate us as well as our audience.
I think the main message is, I think, don't underestimate just how good the top drivers are at what they do. I see a lot of online discourse about it, and it gets a bit odd at times. And you kind of need that online. You need the insanity to a certain extent, because it's a consequence of something being high value. It's when you, like with karting, nobody talks about karting. So I would love people to have mad conspiracy theories about karting, because it means people are interested. Like people they'll say, oh, it's a waste of time comparing drivers from different eras, and I'm like, no, it's not, because if people didn't do that and they weren't talking about that, it means your series is dead, because nobody comes up with stuff. Like, you want to compare Fangio with Max Verstappen, because if people weren't interested to come up with this stuff, no one would care. It means no one cares about the sport.
Right.
I think with motorsport in general, I think we need just to understand the nature of why I see a lot of discourse around IndyCar and people going, oh, it needs better marketing and all of that kind of stuff. And the point is really that the fundamental issue with IndyCar is it's single make chassis, and that removes a lot of the stakes from the sport. People used to say F1, it's the same car winning every race. And I'm like, IndyCar, it's the same car winning every race in perpetuity. So you can't go from the perspective of IndyCar saying, do you have to understand why some motorsports are more successful than others? Why one motorsport feels more high stakes than the other, and not to get too lost in the notion that close racing matters as much as high stakes racing. So with something like IndyCar, when people are always there's a lot of discourse around its relative lack of popularity, should I say. And they have to understand it's not a question of whether the racing is entertaining or not. It's whether it feels important. It's why the Indy 500 matters and most of the others don't feel like they matter, because the Indy 500 has heritage and history and it's tangible. These are weird things that are hard to explain with language, but we instinctively all care about the Indy 500, but we don't really care about the next race. I think this year it was Detroit, if I recall correctly, which I think is kind of a cool race because it's historic and if you like historic stuff, but you can feel the kind of it's a bit of a it's like, oh, it's a bit of a afterthought, so it's trying to understand, especially with at the moment where I'm at the moment, is trying to explain to people that marketing can only do so much. You have to look at the fundamentals. Why a series like IndyCar might struggle compared to F1, and why, I think F1 has seen growth in America versus IndyCar, where there seems to be this constant talk about it not being popular enough. And it's a difficult one. I'm not saying IndyCar should change. I just think you need to understand why IndyCar is going to struggle relative to F1, because during the winter, you have no articles about IndyCar chassis. But in F1, you'll have hundreds of articles about minor things like, oh, this piece of carbon is flexing under load. And that you'll get 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 articles over one small component.
Yeah.
In IndyCar, you don't really have that. So I just like to not to put down IndyCar in any way, because I actually think visually they're more entertaining to watch than F1, purely as I like to watch drivers because they look a bit hard. They look harder to drive, but it doesn't mean they are. So I do appreciate, and I think there's a lot of top drivers in IndyCar as well. But I like just to make sure that we understand really the nature of popularity and why F1 becomes popular, because you can do articles about everything all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It is constant. Whether it be stewarding decisions, whether it be, I don't know, what was the row about bibs, and whether Red Bull were hiding and changing the bib height and stuff like that. It's like a constant stream. Those stories do actually exist in IndyCar. I'm sure they do. I know dampers and there's certain aspects that aren't spec, but that's something I think people need to just. I think that conversation needs to evolve a bit more. It's not, people are always attacking IndyCars not having good enough marketing, and I'm like, no, there's a bit more. There's fundamental differences that you need to grapple with in if you want to change perception of that area of motorsport. I know it's a bit on a tangent, but that's something I think is an interesting area to explore.
Yeah,
So
that's
learning about why F1 seems to be gaining traction in America. I mean, it wasn't always like that. IndyCar used to be a threat to F1,
right?
And now it isn't, and it's obvious to me why. Whether that's economically viable or not is a completely different question.
Right.
Building their own chassis again, because I just don't think financially they can cope with it. But like F1 is it's the Pareto distribution. They're just the 1% aspect of motorsport now controls 80% of the revenue in motorsport. I think F1 is accelerating its dominance in motorsport, and I don't think people really appreciate just how dominant F1 is and how much control it has over the cultural narrative our sport now has. Like whether you're into touring cars, whether you're into WEC, F1. I mean, WEC's going through a bit of a good phase, but outside of Le Mans, not that many people are interested. So that's something I find quite interesting.
Yep.
Just the nature of business and marketing.
No, that's great. That's a whole nother podcast.
That's what I was going to say. I think you're good with this, Alan. I really would love to have follow-up conversations on some of these things because I love contrarians. Maybe that's the attorney in me. I like differing opinions. I think that we should be able to challenge our presumptions or even prevailing thought. And if someone can do that civilly and intellectually honest, I really respect that. And I hope that you feel like this is a good use of your time and be willing to come back and have conversation with us on some of these things that you've kind of laid some seeds here.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you're saying you're an attorney, because motorsport is just attorneys going racing. It's that. I do think in another life I would have been a good lawyer, because you do dive into the regulations and you are like looking for loopholes constantly.
That's right.
It's so interesting trying to, because I've written regulations for kart series, and you're always trying to close loopholes, and it is a very good intellectual creative thing. It's like, as as an attorney, it is actually quite creative. People think law's black and white, and it's like, it's not really. So it is. That's why F1 is so intriguing to people, and whether the racing's close or not is not that interesting. It's high stakes, and that's what matters.
Yeah. Well, Dick, you got any other thoughts before we close out?
I thoroughly enjoyed visiting with you, Alan. You've really got me thinking about a number of things, and most of it is with me as a driver. You've said a couple of things where I was sort of like, how adaptable am I really? And the answer is not very much. I have to practice a lot in order to be able to be good. Whereas, and I've known this for a long time now, I'm not a natural talent. I just have a work ethic. And so I love what you say about like learning a new track. That's something that until I can drive where the driving is subconscious, learning a new track for me is incredibly difficult.
That is interesting. Well, we could do a whole podcast on that.
Yeah.
Right. The strategies for that. Because I find learning tracks from a psychological point of view is very interesting, because from my own personal experience, if I'm on a sim, it takes me a long time to learn a track, but in reality, you do it within 2 laps. And I find that kind of that difference in the way that the brain functions in a virtual and real environment, something I'd love to understand a bit more in time. But it's one of the many aspects of my interest that sometimes you can't dive down every rabbit hole.
Right.
Try my
best. Understood. Yep.
Or you just prioritize it. You say, I'll do it later. And get
that's just a big list of it later.
Yes. Exactly. Well, on that note, we'll have to do this again. I really appreciate your time, Alan. I know Dick agrees with me that this has been fantastic. So
absolutely,
we can have you again on our show.
Thank you. Yeah, I've had a good fun. And I know I talk about karting a lot, but it's just this whole spectrum of motorsports, a very colourful, interesting thing. And, I understand, I watch every F1 race. I follow it biblically, but, it's always an interesting thing to look at everything else and absorb it and learn from it. And hopefully one day some of your listeners might get encouraged to try it themselves. And I'm always there to encourage people that, I did some video called the Budget Kart Challenge, which was about buying a kart as cheaply as possible and racing it as cheaply as possible. And hopefully that inspires a few people. Just, you can sit there and enjoy it, but it changes your perspective on racing if you've given it a go yourself to any sort of serious degree, because you can start to appreciate the pressures that the drivers are under. And I think before I sign off, I see a lot of talk about that at the moment, and some of the pressure the drivers are under and the lives that they lead are incredibly difficult. And I know they're paid a lot of money, but I think Max Verstappen talks about it quite well, and it's worth taking that on board, because it's difficult. It is difficult. It invades your every waking thought when you're racing. It is quite overwhelming. So I'd always encourage people to give it a go, and changes your perspective on things and hopefully improves your interaction with the sport as well.
Yeah, love it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you, Alan.
Thanks for having me on. I've had good fun.
Great fun.
Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Drop me a line via email, sabrina@2guysaGirlandF1.com. Can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. And with that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in, because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.